Hello everyone and welcome to round 10 of the FIDE candidates. My name is Jessie February and I'll be running you through all the games of today. The 10th round of the candidates tournament in Madrid has concluded. Jan Nepomniachtchi has somehow expanded his lead to 1.5 points. Usually such a lead in this event would mean less excitement because of how meaningless second place is. This year there is an excellent chance the second place finisher will get a spot in the World Championship match as well, because the current champion Magnus Carlsen has expressed ambivalence about playing. In Game 1, we saw Richard Rapport play Ding Liren. For mysterious reasons, Ding Liren has had trouble finding many games against other super grandmasters for the last couple of years. There were questions about what sort of form he would be in for this event, and he seems to have hit his stride at a good moment. Let's take a look at the game to find out what happened. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and we have Aurelio Pairs, otherwise known as the Spanish, bishop g5, which I quite like, and bishop a7, probably planning a future c5. And after knight a5, bishop c2, c5 was played, knight to d2, g5, and bishop to g3. After knight h5, a3, rook b8, multifunctional move. So one of the ideas is to bring the rook to the 7th rank, which is implemented in this game. So we see king h1 and rook to b7, b4, knight c6, and bishop to b3. Considered a unnecessary maneuver. Bishop c2, bishop b3, bishop d5. Yeah, and rook c7, bishop to d5. There was no necessity on this move. And after g4 by black, it gives white a chance to activate the dark squared bishop with bishop from g3 to h4. So white has played bishop to h4. White uses the provided chance to activate its bishop, and after knight to e7, there's knight to g1. So white prepares the break on the f-file, either f3 or f4. After capturing on b4, white simply takes back with the a-pawn. Rook takes c3, gives white counterplay. Knight e2, rook back to c7, and f4 was played f6, taking, and the king is looking a little unsafe. So knight g3 here, knight takes, pawn takes, I really like, and rook to f8. Rook takes f6, capturing the pawn back, and after rook takes, bishop takes, and queen to d6, queen f1, and bishop to d4. And this allows white to equalize. Next move is incredibly beautiful. In the case of king takes, white will just play bishop takes e5, winning the queen. So here, king to d7 and rook to d1. Rook c2, bishop b3 attacking the rook, and rook c7, knight to c4. The risky decision to open up the d-file, but also sacrificing a piece. After pawn takes, rook c6 and bishop to a4. And yes, this was intentional, but to give back the exchange, knight takes and b5. Although white can equalize in the game, in the complex position, black has more chances and it is easier to play for black. After c5, queen to e6, bishop to h4, and bishop takes c5. Rook c1, pinning the bishop to the king, queen to d6, and queen c4. It was the first sign that white was in trouble, and after knight to d3, rook c3, the decisive blunder here, capturing on b5, queen takes d3, and yes, white is an exchange up. Unfortunately, the b-pawn is just too powerful. King b6, and here white tries to get one of the pawns back, but regardless, king g1, b4, the pawn is just unstoppable. King to c2, pawn was well guarded there on g4, and after b3, king to d3, bishop to a1, king captures on e4. Richard Rapport resigns in this position. In Game 2, we saw Jan-Christoph Duda versus Fabiano Caruana. Caruana uncharacteristically got the worst of the opening and met Duda's novelty with a couple of inaccurate moves. He already had some problems around move 14. Caruana's kingside pawns raced forward to support an attack that never quite arrived, and eventually it was his own king that was in trouble. Duda eventually traded down, and easily winning endgame and finished it off. In this game, we have another Italian, and after a6, a4, bishop a7, rook e1, capturing, opening up the f-file for black there, and black does manage to get the knight to f4, and after bishop takes f4 here, making the black pieces less harmonious, but also removing one of black's most active pieces here. Queen takes on f4 and queen to b3. There is no threat on the king side, and white is better. So after rook to f6, trying to prepare the attack on the king side, however, it has been necessary to adjust the placement of black's pieces here. And after b5, knight to a5 and queen to a2, completely cutting off the knight, g5 was played. Trying to escalate the situation leads to the loss of the position here for black. And after knight to h2, rook g6, trying to back up the g5 pawn, and a beautiful counter in the center, d4, capturing here, taking advantage of the center. And after h5, g3, queen to f6, rook comes in, d1 bringing the rook g7, and king to h1, preparing h3 to h4 and opening the king side. Rook to f8, taking on e5, capturing back, and h4 was played. Capture, and rook to g1. And here we find that black is the one with the weak king side and is in trouble. And after knight to g5, king h8, and queen to e2, bringing the queen back to the king side, but also targeting h5, queen to g6 here, and rook to d3, going to double up the rooks on the g file. No matter the b pawn, queen to e8, and capturing back on b5, rook f6, and queen to f1 here. Instead, rook 3 to g2 was suggested with the f2 to f4 idea still in place. And after b6 by black, queen goes to g2, forming that beautiful battery we've spoken about in previous rounds. Queen to f8, queen h3, queen to g8, and rook 1 to g2. Knight b7, knight h7, and knight h7. What a fantabulous move. After rook f to g6, capturing the rook, and knight back to the outpost on g5, rook f6, and f4 has been played. Using the placement of the b7 knight, white conducts a decisive blow and decoys the black bishop to the e5 square. After knight to c5 here, f takes, bishop takes, and knight to f3, targeting the bishop. And after queen to a8, there's knight takes on e4, knight to f3, queen check, and king to h2. And let's take a look at what is going on here. White is up a piece for one pawn. It looks rather scary. After rook g1 and king f4, Fabiano unfortunately resigns the game. In game 3, we saw Jan Nepomniachtchi versus Timur Radjabov, with Nepomniachtchi having a big lead in the tournament and Radjabov having a bit of a reputation for quick draws. There was some danger of an early end to this one. These two players met in an infamous third-place match of the 2021 FTC Crypto Cup, where they blatantly played to work around the event's anti-draw offer rule as quickly as possible. Fortunately, nothing like that happened this time, although the game was hardly played on the razor's edge either. Nepomniachtchi was slightly better throughout the Catalan game, but never any more than that. He understandably wasn't interested in taking any big risks and tried to win. So let's see how this Catalan was in fact played. Catalan is one of my favorite openings to play against with the black pieces here. And after capturing on c4, black tries to maintain that extra pawn, but white gets it back on b5. And after c5 by black, trying to open up the center, queen to a5, not even bishop takes c5, and knight to c3. Queen takes back, and after bishop e3 targeting the queen, queen simply moves back to a5, controlling that open file on a, and bishop d2. And now bishop to a8, still controlling this entire diagonal, knight d1, and queen to c5. The queen on the c5 square will be on the hanging position and interferes with the c file for the rook instead here. So knight to e3, now black should work hard to equalize the game. And after rook c8, rook c1, and bishop to d5, knight takes on d5, getting the two bishops, removing the best defender of the c4 pawn here. And after knight takes, knight to e5, knight b6, and queen e4. It is attractive to centralize the queen, as Nimzovich has taught, but it is not the best decision in the current position. After bishop to f6, bishop to c3. Knight to d7 and bishop to d4 attacking the queen again, as we noted that the queen was going to become rather a liability for black and having to find squares for the queen eventually. After knight takes on d7, the bishop is traded and queen takes on b6, defending the bishop on e4. And black grabs the pawn on b2, but white does the same on c4 and queen a6 just defending the back rank. Trading the rooks, now going into a completely equal position with 4 pawns aside and opposite color bishops. What more could you ask for when you are playing against the leader of the tournament? And here we find that moves are just repeated and players agreed to a draw. In Game 4, we had Hikaru Nakamura versus Alireza Firouzja. Fans of exciting double-edged chess will be sad to see the Najdov treated so roughly at the top level. The same opening failed Maxim Vasilograf in a critical game against Caruana towards the end of the last candidates tournament in 2021. And in a typical Najdov fashion, it was probably losing before Caruana was even out of preparation. In this game, Alireza eventually achieved a standard Najdov d5 break, but there was a terrible price to pay. This game truly was one of a kind, so let's take a look at the Sicilian Najdov and knight f6. I do have to ask you guys in the comments, how would you pronounce Najdov? Is it Najdov or Najdov, or do you have a specific way of saying it? Do let me know in the comments. And after bishop e3, e5, knight back to f3. Here I'm very familiar with knight to c3, but knight f3 is also common here after bishop c4, bishop e6, and knight to d5, lodging the knight on the d5 square, stopping black from ever hoping to get d5 in themselves. And after rook to c8, knight takes on f6, pawn takes, and bishop to b3. So Nakamura decides to preserve the configuration of the pawn structure here, and after knight to e7, white simply castles. It is clear to see that the plan of black is to eventually play d5, and after capturing on b3, we do in fact see d5 by Alireza, and after takes on d5, queen takes, and queen to e2. Nakamura refuses to trade queens, and after knight to f5, we have rook d1 attacking the queen, queen c6, and c4. Bishop to b7 here. The development of the bishop is no way fully giving the queen side to white. And after rook to d4, beautiful move for white, capturing the d-file. Black is deprived of any counterplay here, and castles for black, doubling up on the d-file for white. And rook f to e8, h3, b5, and trying to create some counterplay on the queen side here. But white decides to play c5, reduces the significant part of the advantage. Better was bishop to c5. The main idea is using the position of the knight on the f5 square. The main idea is using the position of the knight on the f5 square to white's advantage. And after c5, black simply plays bishop to f8. b4 by white, backing up the pawn, and knight to d4 was played. Knight takes on d4, queen takes rook, and knight to f5 heading towards the king side. Queen simply goes to e4 and queen to h5, saying, I mean business. I want this game to end in my favor, offering a trade of rooks, and white says, no, I want to keep the only rook I have left on the board, goes to a1 and rook to c6. After bishop to a6, removing the one and only defender here, the bishop on f8, king goes to h8, and rook to a3, wanting to swing over to the king side, bringing the final piece into the attack. Queen takes on b4 and bishop takes f8, rook takes f8, and queen h6 just attacking the rook. The rook goes to g8, but even after rook to g3, rook takes g3, pawn takes g3, unfortunately the game is over, threatening mate on both f8 and g7 alike. Thank you all for being here for the analysis. I'm enjoying myself thoroughly, and I hope you are too. I will see you tomorrow.